Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the Untamed West, justice is most often spoken from the barrel of a gun. It's a loud, fiery, and sudden thing. But what happens when a man's soul is burned so quiet that he has no use for the thunder of gunpowder? What happens when his grief is so profound, his rage so cold, that he seeks a vengeance that is silent, personal, and patient? Tonight, we tell the story of such a man, who hunted monsters not with a pistol, but with a simple tool of his trade. A tale of a man, a rope, and a promise made to ash and bone. A tale we call The Hangman's Harvest. The life of Luke Mercer was a quiet and beautiful thing, woven from the simple, sturdy threads of hard work, honest love, and the rich, dark soil of the Texas plains. His ranch was not an empire, but it was an Eden, a small kingdom he had carved from the wilderness with his own two hands. It was a world measured in the smell of new mown hay, the lowing of fat cattle at dusk, the creak of a porch swing, and the sound of his wife's laughter, a sound that, for Luke, was the truest measure of wealth in a world obsessed with gold. Sarah, his wife, was the sun around which his world turned. She had a spirit as bright and resilient as a prairie sunflower, and a smile that could gentle the wildest colt or the most weary of men. She was the heart of their home, filling it with the scent of baking bread and the warmth of a love that was as steady and unconditional as the rising sun. Their son, 5-year-old Ben, was the lifeblood. He was a whirlwind of joyous energy, with his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's fiery red hair. To watch him chase butterflies in the tall grass, his laughter echoing in the clean, open air, was to know a perfect and profound peace. Luke's days were a rhythm of honest labor. He was a master of his craft, and his most essential tool was his lariat. It was a 60-foot length of braided rawhide, perfectly balanced, a part of him as natural as his own arm. He could drop a loop over the horns of a running steer from 50 feet, his throw a fluid, effortless poem of motion. That rope was a tool of life. It brought in the cattle that fed them, secured the wagon that took them to town, and mended the fences that protected their small, perfect world. It was a symbol of his trade, of the gentle, ordered life he had built. The end of that life came on a Tuesday. It came on the wind, a hot, dry wind that smelled of dust and malice. It came in the form of a dozen riders who appeared on the horizon as the sun was setting, their forms dark silhouettes against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. They were the Red Vultures, a name whispered in fear across the territory, a plague of locusts in human form. They were led by a man named Bryn Hollis, a man with a charming smile and the eyes of a dead snake. Luke had seen them from the barn and had just enough time to get Sarah and Ben into the house before they arrived. He stood on his porch, unarmed, his hands held open in a gesture of peace. He had nothing of value for men like these. He was a simple rancher. This had to be a mistake. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Luke asked, his voice steady, belying the frantic hammering of his heart. Bryn Hollis dismounted, his spurs jingling a death knell on the porch steps. "That's a fine piece of land you've got here, Mercer," he said, his smile never touching his dead eyes. "A little too fine for a dirt-scrabbling family man. We've come to take it off your hands." "This is my home," Luke said, his voice hard. "It's not for sale." Hollis chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Everything's for sale. You just haven't heard my offer." He gestured to his men, who dismounted, their faces masks of casual cruelty. They spread out, surrounding the small house. The events that followed were a blur of nightmarish, disjointed horror. They did not try to bargain. They had come for destruction. They dragged Luke from the porch, beating him with a savage, gleeful efficiency. He fought back with the desperate strength of a husband and father, but he was 1 against 12. They broke his ribs, shattered his arm, and left him a bloody, broken heap in the dust of his own yard. But they did not kill him. Death would have been a mercy. Their cruelty was far more refined than that. They held him down, forcing his head up, forcing him to watch as they dragged Sarah and a screaming, terrified Ben from the house. He saw the terror in his wife's eyes, the uncomprehending fear on his son's face. He strained against the hands that held him, a raw, inhuman sound of pure agony tearing from his throat. "A man should watch his world end," Hollis whispered in his ear, his breath hot and foul. "He should see what he was too weak to protect." They forced his family back inside the house. Then, with a horrifying, casual deliberation, they began to set it on fire. They threw torches onto the dry timber roof and splashed coal oil against the walls. The flames took hold with a greedy, explosive roar. The house, his Eden, the home he had built with his own two hands, became a funeral pyre. Through the haze of his own blood and tears, Luke could see the silhouettes of his wife and son in the upstairs window, trapped. He heard their screams. He would hear them for the rest of his life, a constant, looping soundtrack in the silent chambers of his ruined soul. The red vultures watched the inferno for a time, their faces lit by the hellish, orange glow, their expressions a mixture of sadistic pleasure and simple, bovine boredom. Then, their work done, they mounted their horses and rode away, their laughter swallowed by the roar of the fire. They left Luke Mercer there, a broken man in the ashes of his broken life. He lay there for an eternity, suspended between a life that was over and a death that would not come. The heat of the fire scorched his skin, but he felt nothing but a cold so profound it seemed to freeze the marrow in his bones. The world went silent, save for the crackle of the flames and the terrible, echoing screams in his mind. He awoke to a world of gray ash and gray sky. The dawn was breaking, its pale, indifferent light illuminating a scene of absolute devastation. The house was a smoking, skeletal ruin. The life he had known was a memory. The man he had been was a ghost. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a symphony of agony, but the physical pain was a distant, irrelevant thing. He was a walking tomb, a vessel filled with nothing but the ashes of his family. He stumbled through the ruins, his bare feet sinking into the hot, gray powder. There was nothing left. Nothing. And then he saw it. On a fence post near the barn, a post that had somehow escaped the main blaze, his lariat was coiled. The 60-foot length of braided rawhide, the tool of his trade, of his life, was untouched, a single, perfect thing in a world of char and ruin. He walked to it, his movements stiff and robotic. He took the rope from the post. He ran his hand over the familiar, smooth texture. It felt cool in his hands. He looked at the rope, then at the smoking ruin of his home. He looked up at the empty, pitiless sky. He walked to the remains of the barn and found his rifle, its wooden stock burned away, its barrel warped and useless. He left it in the ashes. He had no use for guns. A gun was too quick, too loud, too merciful. The justice he sought would be slow. It would be silent. It would be as intimate and as personal as the hands that had taken everything from him. He buried what was left of his wife and son in a single, shallow grave under the lone oak tree that still stood at the edge of the property. He did not cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of him. He stood over the grave for a long time, the rawhide rope coiled in his hand. He made a silent promise to the scorched earth, a vow of such cold, absolute finality that the very air seemed to grow still. Then, he turned his back on the ashes of his Eden and began to walk. He had no horse, no food, no water. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a grief that had calcified into a diamond-hard purpose, and the single, terrible tool of his new trade. The rancher named Luke Mercer was dead, buried with his family. The thing that walked away from that ruin was something else entirely. It was a hunter, and the hangman's harvest was about to begin. The desert was a crucible, designed to burn away all that was weak and sentimental. For Luke Mercer, there was nothing left to burn. He was already a creature of ash and ember, a hollowed-out man animated by a single, cold fire. He walked for 3 days, fueled by a grief so profound it transcended the needs of the flesh. He did not feel the gnawing hunger in his belly or the raw, sandpaper scrape of his parched throat. The sun beat down on him, blistering his skin, but the cold inside him was a more powerful force. The physical world had become a distant, irrelevant dream. The only reality was the roaring fire in his memory and the faces of the men who had lit it. He had burned their faces into his mind during those terrible, final moments. He remembered each one with a preternatural clarity, the one with the jagged scar across his cheek, the hulking, bearded giant, the rat-faced man with the nervous laugh, and their leader, Bren Hollis, with his dead, snake-like eyes. He had a ledger of 12 names written in his soul, and he would cross them off one by one. On the 4th day, near death from dehydration, he stumbled upon a small, muddy creek. He drank, not with the desperation of a dying man, but with the methodical purpose of a machine taking on fuel. His body was a tool, and he needed it to function. He found a rabbit in a snare set by some long-gone trapper and ate it raw, the raw meat a sacrament to the primal, animalistic purpose that now drove him. He followed the trail of the red vultures, not with any great tracking skill, but with a simple, unerring instinct. He knew the kind of men they were. They would seek out the festering sores of civilization, the grimy, lawless boomtowns and isolated saloons where their brand of violent greed could flourish. He followed the rumors, the whispers of a dozen men who rode hard and spent their money with the careless abandon of men who knew it wasn't theirs. His hunt led him to a small, dusty settlement called Purgatory Flats, a town that was little more than a collection of saloons and cat houses catering to the rough men who worked the nearby silver mines. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and despair. It was the perfect hunting ground. Luke did not stride into town like an avenger. He slipped in like a shadow, a gaunt, ragged figure who drew no attention. He was just another piece of human debris washed up on the shores of this desperate place. He took a job mucking out the stables at the largest saloon, a position that paid him in floor space to sleep on and leftover scraps of food. It was a humiliating existence, but it was the perfect listening post. From the shadows of the stable, he could watch the town, learn its rhythms, and identify his prey. He found the first one on his third night, a big, barrel-chested man with a thick, greasy beard, whose booming laugh echoed from the saloon. Luke recognized him instantly. He was one of the men who had held him down, whose sweaty, calloused hands had been a part of his torment. The man's name, he learned from the saloon chatter, was Jed. Luke did not act immediately. He watched. He studied. He learned the man's habits with the patience of a spider. He saw that Jed was a creature of routine. Every night, he would drink until he was stupid, then stumble out the back door of the saloon to visit the cat house on the other side of the alley. On the fifth night, Luke was ready. He had spent the day in the hills, practicing, not with a gun, but with his rope. The familiar feel of the braided rawhide in his hands was a comfort, a connection to the man he had once been. But the purpose was different. He was not practicing for roping cattle. He was practicing for roping a man. He learned to throw a smaller, faster loop. He learned how to pull it tight with a single, brutal snap of the wrist. The tool of life had been reforged into an instrument of death. That night, he waited in the deepest shadows of the alley, a place where the feeble lamplight from the saloon did not reach. He was as still as a stone. The only thing alive about him were his eyes, which burned with a cold, gray fire in the darkness. Just as he had for the past 4 nights, Jed stumbled out the back door, reeking of whiskey and cheap cigars. He was humming a tuneless, drunken dirge as he made his way down the alley. Luke did not move until Jed was almost past him. Then, he stepped from the shadows. Jed, startled, turned to face him, his hand instinctively going for the pistol on his hip. He was drunk, his reaction slow. He squinted into the darkness, trying to place the gaunt, ragged figure before him. "Who in the hell are you?" Jed slurred. "You burned my house," Luke said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of dust and dead leaves. "You killed my boy." Recognition, followed by a dawning, sober terror, washed over Jed's face. He remembered the rancher, the man they had left for dead. "You?" he stammered, fumbling for his gun. But Luke was already in motion. The lariat, which had been coiled in his left hand, and spooled with a soundless hiss. The loop, small and tight, flew through the air. It was a perfect throw. It settled over Jed's head and around his thick neck before he could even clear leather. Luke did not hesitate. He dug his heels into the dirt and pulled back with all his strength. The loop snapped tight. Jed let out a choked, gurgling cry, his hands clawing at the rawhide that was biting deep into his flesh. His pistol fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering into the dust. The struggle was brutal and silent. There were no gunshots, no screams to alert the town. There was only the terrible, intimate sound of a man being strangled, of his desperate, wheezing gasps for air, of the frantic scrabbling of his boots in the dirt. Luke's face was a mask of cold, emotionless concentration. He felt the man's life, his frantic, terrified struggle, through the rope, and he felt nothing. No pity, no remorse, no satisfaction. There was only the mechanical completion of a task. When it was over, when Jed's body finally went limp, Luke did not let go. He held the rope taut for a long, silent minute, making sure the job was done. Then, he let the body fall to the ground. He coiled his rope, the rawhide stained with the sweat and filth of his first victim. One knot was tied in the long, dark rope of his vengeance. 11 more to go. He did not leave the body in the alley. He hauled it over his shoulder, his broken ribs screaming in protest, and carried it to the one place in town that served as a symbol of authority, the sheriff's office. The office was empty, the sheriff having long ago been bought or intimidated into irrelevance. Luke kicked open the door. Using his rope, he hoisted Jed's body up and over a wooden rafter, leaving it to hang in the center of the room, a gruesome pendulum announcing a new and terrible form of justice in Purgatory Flats. He then turned and walked out of the office, melting back into the night. He was gone from the town before the sun rose, leaving behind a dead body, a single, terrifying clue, and a legend that was just beginning to be born. The hangman was on the hunt, and the red vultures were about to learn that there are fates far worse than a quick bullet. The discovery of Jed's body sent a shockwave of fear through the criminal underworld of Purgatory Flats. It wasn't the death itself that was so terrifying. Death was a common commodity in these parts. It was the manner of it. A man hanged, not from a tree after a trial, but from the rafters of the sheriff's office, strangled with a cattleman's lariat. There was a cold, deliberate intimacy to it that was more unsettling than a dozen gunshot victims. It was a statement, an execution. The news traveled fast, carried by frightened drifters and gossiping saloon girls. In the grimy saloons and back-alley gambling dens across the territory, men began to talk of a new kind of ghost, a silent killer who hunted with a rope. The red vultures, scattered to the winds as they spent their stolen gold, heard the whispers, and they began to feel the first, cold prickle of fear. Luke, meanwhile, had moved on, a phantom on the dusty roads. He was no longer just following rumors, he was weaving a web. He knew that the vultures, arrogant and brutish, would dismiss Jed's death as a drunken brawl or a deal gone wrong. He needed to take another one, and then another, to establish a pattern, to let them know, unequivocally, that they were being hunted. His journey led him to a raucous, muddy cattle town on the Kansas border named Redemption. The name was a bitter, cosmic joke. The town was a cesspool of violence and vice, a place where cattle fortunes were made and lost, and where a man's life was worth less than the price of a good horse. It was here that Luke picked up the trail of his next two targets. They were a pair of brothers, Silas and Jesse, who had been part of Hollis's gang. They were bullies and braggarts, and they were spending their share of the money from a recent train robbery with loud, ostentatious flair. Luke found them holding court in the town's largest saloon, The Last Chance, surrounded by sycophants and whores, their laughter echoing off the rafters. They were easy to find. Too easy. Luke, now looking even more gaunt and haunted, his clothes little more than rags, took a job as a swamper in that very saloon. He was the lowest of the low, the invisible man who swept the floors, cleaned the spittoons, and emptied the trash. No one gave him a second glance. He was just part of the filth. From this vantage point, he watched the brothers for a week. He learned their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. Silas, the older brother, was a card sharp, spending his nights at a high-stakes poker game in a back room. Jesse, the younger and more brutish of the two, had a weakness for the saloon's cheapest whiskey and a particular red-headed prostitute. Luke decided to take them both in one night, to sever two heads from the snake at once. His plan was one of cold, psychological warfare. He would use their own sins against them. He started with Jesse. He waited until the younger brother was thoroughly drunk and had stumbled upstairs with the prostitute to her small, grimy room. Luke, who had spent the past week memorizing the layout of the building, slipped up the back stairs. He picked the flimsy lock on the adjoining room's door and waited. He could hear the drunken fumbling and coarse laughter through the thin wall. He waited until the sounds died down, until all he could hear was Jesse's heavy, rhythmic snoring. He slipped from his room into the darkened hallway. The prostitute, having taken her money, had already left. He entered Jesse's room. The man was sprawled on the bed, dead to the world, the reek of cheap whiskey filling the air. Luke moved with a silent, terrifying grace. He uncoiled his lariat. He did not wake the man. He looped the rope around the bedpost at the head of the bed, then around Jesse's thick neck. He pulled it taut, securing it with a knot he had perfected, a knot that would only tighten under pressure. He had created a leash. Then, he took a full bottle of whiskey from the man's saddlebag and smashed it on the floor, splashing the potent liquid all over the wooden floorboards and the edge of the bed. He took a match, lit it, and tossed it onto the whiskey-soaked floor. The fire erupted with a whoosh, a line of blue and orange flame racing across the room. Luke did not wait to watch. He slipped out of the room, locking the door from the outside, and disappeared back into the shadows of the hotel. Downstairs, Silas was still at the poker game. The first sign of trouble was the smell of smoke, followed by a woman's scream from the hallway above. The saloon erupted into chaos as people realized the hotel was on fire. Silas, his game forgotten, rushed into the hallway and up the stairs, knowing his brother was up there. He found Jesse's door locked. He and two other men threw their shoulders against it, the cheap wood splintering. They burst into a room filled with thick, black smoke and raging flames. They saw Jesse, awake now, screaming, tied to the bed by the neck. He was trying to scramble away from the flames that were licking at the foot of the bed, but every movement only tightened, and the noose around his throat. He was being simultaneously burned and strangled, a vision of pure, hellish torment. They tried to get to him, to cut him free, but the heat and the smoke were too intense. They were driven back, choking and gasping. The last thing they saw before the ceiling collapsed was Jesse's face, a mask of blackened agony, his eyes wide with a terror that no man should ever have to witness. Silas stood in the hallway, his face pale with horror, watching his brother be consumed. And it was in that moment of distraction, of grief and shock, that Luke came for him. Luke emerged from the smoke-filled chaos of the hallway like an avenging angel from hell. He ignored the flames, the panicked crowd. His eyes were fixed on Silas. Silas turned and saw him, and in the gaunt, smoke-stained face, he recognized the rancher. "You!" Silas roared, his grief turning to rage. He drew his pistol. But Luke was prepared. This was not an ambush in a dark alley. This was a direct confrontation. As Silas drew his gun, Luke's hand moved, not for a weapon, but for the lariat still coiled at his side. He didn't throw a loop. He swung the entire, heavy coil of rope like a flail. The weighted end, a solid knot of braided rawhide, caught Silas square in the gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol went flying. Silas screamed in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. Luke was on him in a flash, tackling him, driving him back, not into the fire, but away from it, through the panicked crowd, and out the front doors of the saloon. They crashed into the muddy street, a tangle of limbs. Luke was a creature of pure, cold fury. His fists, hardened by years of ranch work, were like hammers. He beat Silas into a bloody, semi-conscious state, then dragged his broken body into the center of the street. The whole town was now gathered, watching the hotel burn, their faces lit by the flickering, orange light. They now had a new spectacle. In the center of the street, the gaunt, silent stranger looped his rope around Silas's neck. He threw the other end over the high, wooden sign of the saloon itself. With a cold, methodical strength, he began to pull. Silas, dazed and broken, was hoisted into the air, his legs kicking feebly. He was part of the Red Vultures. Luke's voice, raw and powerful, cut through the noise of the fire. They burned a family for their land. A woman and a child. This is not murder. This is a reckoning. He secured the rope to a hitching post, leaving Silas to swing, a silhouette against the backdrop of his brother's funeral pyre. 3 more knots were tied. Luke Mercer did not stay to receive the town's thanks or to answer its questions. He retrieved Silas's horse and a bag of coins from the poker table, a small, partial repayment for all he had lost. Then he mounted up and rode out of redemption, leaving behind a legacy of fire, fear, and a terrible, silent justice. The whisper of the rope was becoming a roar, a sound that was beginning to strike terror into the heart of every guilty man who heard it. The road of vengeance is a solitary one. It is a path paved with memory and fueled by a rage that consumes all other human emotion. For Luke Mercer, the world had shrunk to a singular, relentless focus, the hunt. The faces of the remaining 8 men were a constant presence, superimposed over every landscape, their phantom laughter echoing in the howl of the wind. But there were other ghosts on that lonely road, gentler and far more painful. The memories of his life before the fire were a constant, aching torment. He would be riding through a stretch of country, the late afternoon sun turning the tall grass to gold, and he would be ambushed by the memory of his son, Ben. chasing grasshoppers in a field just like this one. He would smell bread baking from a distant homesteader's cabin and be thrown back to the warm, comforting scent of Sarah's kitchen. A memory so vivid and so painful it would steal the breath from his lungs. These moments were the true torture. The killings were a cold, mechanical necessity, a balancing of a dark and terrible ledger. But the memories of the love he had lost were a fire that burned hotter than any physical flame. They were a constant reminder of what had been taken, of the man he had once been. He had been a man who could build, who could nurture, who could love. Now, he was only a thing that could destroy. This internal war made him hard, cold, and brutally efficient. He moved through the territories like a wraith, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He learned to live off the land, to read tracks, to become a part of the harsh and forgiving landscape. The soft hands of the rancher had become calloused and hard, not just from work, but from the grim necessities of his quest. His reputation preceded him. The story of the hangman, the silent avenger who hunted with a lariat, had become a staple of campfire tales and saloon gossip. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and a certain grim admiration. In a land where justice was often a commodity for sale, this implacable, incorruptible force of vengeance held a certain terrifying appeal. The remaining members of the Red Vultures were no longer dismissive. They were terrified. They knew they were being hunted by a man who was more than a man. He was a ghost, a legend. They began to look over their shoulders, to see a lariat's loop in every shadow. They changed their names, grew beards, and tried to disappear into the teeming, anonymous underbelly of the West. But they could not escape him. Luke's singular focus made him a peerless hunter. He could pick up the faintest of trails, a carelessly spoken word, a familiar turn of phrase reported by a bartender. He was relentless. He found the fourth man, a gambler named Finn, in a smoky, opulent riverboat casino on the Mississippi. Finn had tried to reinvent himself as a gentleman, but the cheap swagger of the killer still clung to him. Luke didn't confront him on the boat. He waited until the boat docked in a rowdy, lawless port town. He followed Finn into a dark, narrow alley and, in a silent, brutal confrontation, added a fourth knot to his rope. He left the body propped against a garbage heap, the gambler's own card chase of spades, the dead man's hand tucked into his vest. He found the fifth, a hired gun named Court, working as a guard for a corrupt cattle baron in the Wyoming Territory. Court was good, fast with a gun, and always surrounded by other men. Luke couldn't get to him quietly, so he changed his tactics. He used the cattle baron's own greed against him, starting a rumor of a phantom herd of unbranded cattle in a distant box canyon. Court and two other men were sent to investigate. Luke was waiting for them. The two other guards were dispatched with a ruthless efficiency born of necessity. The final confrontation with Court, in the stark, silent beauty of the canyon, was a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle that ended, as it always did, with the tightening of a rawhide loop. With each killing, a small part of the fire inside Luke seemed to cool, but the void it left behind only grew larger. He was becoming less human with each act of vengeance. The memories of Sarah and Ben were beginning to fade, their gentle features growing harder to recall, their laughter more distant. They were being replaced by the terrified, dying faces of his victims. The man he was avenging was disappearing, leaving only the avenger. He rode into a small, quiet town in the Nebraska sandhills, his supplies low, his horse in need of a shoe. He was a gaunt, bearded specter, his eyes haunted, his face a mask of stone. He was no longer just a man on a quest, he was a monument to grief, a walking embodiment of the brutal justice of the frontier. He was in the blacksmith shop, waiting for his horse, when a woman and her small child entered. The boy, no older than Ben had been, had the same fiery red hair. He tripped and fell, scraping his knee. He began to cry, a sound of pure, childish distress. Without thinking, Luke moved. He knelt beside the boy, his movements gentle, his large, calloused hand surprisingly soft as he helped the boy to his feet. "Easy there, little fella," he murmured, his voice rusty and strange, the first gentle words he had spoken in what felt like a lifetime. The boy stopped crying and looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. The mother, who had been about to rush to her son, paused, seeing the profound, heartbreaking sadness in the stranger's face. Luke looked into the boy's innocent, trusting face, and for the first time since the fire, the wall of ice around his heart cracked. A wave of pain, so intense and so pure, washed over him, and it was not the cold fire of rage, but the hot, searing agony of love and loss. He saw his own son, his Ben, in this child's eyes. He stood up abruptly, his face a mask of torment. He turned and fled from the blacksmith's shop, leaving the mother and child staring after him. He mounted his horse and rode out of that town as if the devil himself were on his heels. He rode until the horse was exhausted, until he was miles away, in the heart of the vast, empty plains. He dismounted, and for the first time since he had buried his family, Luke Mercer wept. He collapsed to the ground, and great, shuddering, silent sobs racked his body. He was not crying for the men he had killed. He was crying for the man he had become, for the father and husband who was now a cold, empty thing. The cold and lonely road had led him to a terrible revelation. In his quest to destroy the monsters who had ruined his life, he had become a monster himself. The hunt would continue. The ledger had to be balanced. But now, it was no longer a quest for vengeance. It was a slow, deliberate act of suicide, a journey toward the final confrontation that he hoped would bring an end not just to his enemies, but to his own unbearable pain. The encounter in the Nebraska town left a deep and festering wound in Luke's soul. The cold, mechanical certainty that had driven him was now tainted with the agonizing poison of self-awareness. He was no longer a simple instrument of vengeance. He was a man forced to look at the monster he had become. The memories of Sarah and Ben, which had been a source of fuel for his rage, now returned with a clarity that was a fresh and terrible form of torment. He was killing in their name, but the man he was now was a stranger they would not have recognized, a creature of shadow and violence they would have feared. This internal conflict did not deter him from his path. It made him more resolute. The end was the only salvation, the only way to silence the ghosts. His hunt became less a methodical search and more a relentless, desperate pursuit. He no longer cared about subtlety or sending messages. He just wanted it to be over. He knew that the remaining members of the Red Vultures, their numbers dwindling, their terror growing, would do one of two things: run for the border, or run back to their leader. He gambled on the latter. Men like these were hyenas, and when frightened, they would seek the perceived strength of the pack leader. He stopped hunting the scattered members and started hunting the snake's head, Bren Hollis. The trail was cold, and Hollis was a clever and careful man. He had not been seen since the raid on Luke's ranch. He had taken the lion's share of the plunder from that and other jobs, and had simply vanished. But a man like Hollis, a man whose ego was as vast as his cruelty, could not stay a ghost forever. He needed an audience. He needed power. Luke began to listen to a different kind of rumor. Not of brutish outlaws, but of a new power player, a man with a charming smile, a fat purse, and a cadre of very loyal, very dangerous men. His search led him south, toward the lawless borderlands between Texas and Mexico, a region ruled not by law, but by the man with the most guns. He found Hollis's empire in a sun-bleached, adobe town called Tres Cruces, Three Crosses, a name that seemed to mock the godless nature of the place. Hollis had reinvented himself. He was no longer Bren Hollis, the outlaw. He was Sigor Brennan, a wealthy and respectable landowner who had both the town, the cantina, the sheriff, and the soul of every man in it. He lived in a large, fortified hacienda on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by a dozen well-armed guards, most loyal remnants of the Red Vultures and new recruits drawn to his dark charisma. Luke did not ride into Tres Cruces. He knew that to enter the town was to walk into a spider's web. He spent weeks in the surrounding hills, ghost in the chaparral, living on lizards and cactus fruit, his body pared down to lean muscle and sinew. He watched the hacienda. He studied its routines, the changing of the guards, the delivery of supplies, the comings and goings of Hollis himself. It was a fortress, impenetrable to a frontal assault by a single man. He saw the faces of the men he still hunted among the guards. He saw the one with the jagged scar, a man named Marcus. He saw the rat-faced man, a nervous, twitchy killer named Pike. 6 of the 12 were here, gathered around their master. He could finish more than half his ledger in one final, bloody act. Luke knew he couldn't take them all on directly. He had to draw the snake out of its hole. He needed bait, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that the only bait a man like Hollis would take was an insult to his power, a challenge to his absolute control. He began his assault not on the men, but on Hollis's operations. A supply wagon heading for the hacienda would be found overturned in a dry wash, its contents looted, its driver and guards vanished. A patrol of 3 of Hollis's men, sent to investigate, would ride into a narrow canyon and never ride out. Luke would leave their bodies for the buzzards, with no signature, no rope. He was creating a mystery, a phantom menace that would gnaw at the edges of Hollis's paranoia. Hollis reacted as Luke knew he would, with escalating, brutish force. He sent larger patrols, offered bounties, and terrorized the poorer villagers of Dos Cruces, convinced they were hiding his enemy. His respectable facade began to crack, revealing the violent thud beneath. His men grew jumpy, their trigger fingers itchy. The town, which had been ruled by a quiet, simmering fear, was now on the edge of open rebellion. Luke's final move was a piece of brutal, psychological theater. He knew that Hollis made a weekly trip to a nearby town to meet with a corrupt Mexican official. He always traveled with a guard of 4 of his best men. Luke prepared an ambush at a place called Diablo's Spine, a narrow pass through a ridge of jagged, red rock. He didn't use guns. He used the terrain and his rope. He created a deadfall trap, a lattice of rocks and logs that could be triggered by a single tripwire. As Hollis's party rode into the pass, the lead horse hit the wire. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and timber cascaded down, blocking the path ahead and separating the 2 lead riders from Hollis and the 2 men behind him. Before the dust had even settled, Luke struck. From the rocks above, his lariat snaked out, pulling one of the rear guards from his saddle. Another man, his horse rearing in panic, was an easy target for a heavy rock drop from above. Hollis and his last guard, the scar-faced Marcus, turned and fled, back the way they came, leaving their men to their fate. They rode hard, their faces masks of panic. This was what Luke had wanted. He had not intended to kill Hollis here. He had wanted to strip him of his men, to isolate him, to fill him with the terror of being hunted. He had wanted to make him run. Hollis and Marcus rode into Dos Cruces at a full gallop, screaming about an ambush, about an army in the hills. The carefully constructed illusion of Hollis's power was shattered. He was not an untouchable master. He was a frightened man who had abandoned his men and run for his life. That night, Luke came to Dos Cruces. He walked into the town, not as a shadow, but as an open declaration. He walked to the center of the plaza, to the dry, dusty fountain that served as the town's heart. And there, he waited. He had shown the snake that its hole was not safe. He had shown the hyenas that their leader was a coward. Now, he would wait for the head of the snake to come to him. The final confrontation was at hand. The news of Bren Hollis's cowardly flight from Diablo's Spine spread through Dos Cruces like a contagion. The fear the townspeople had held for their patron was instantly replaced by a simmering, contemptuous disdain. The last remnants of the Red Vultures, seeing their leader exposed as a man who would abandon his own to save himself, felt their loyalty begin to fray. The foundation of Hollis's empire, built on the illusion of invincible strength, was crumbling. And into this powder keg of shifting allegiances, Luke Mercer walked. His arrival in the plaza was not dramatic. He simply appeared as dusk was settling, a gaunt, solitary figure who took up a position near the dry fountain. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a challenge. He simply stood there, his coiled lariat in one hand, his presence a silent, undeniable summons. The town seemed to hold its collective breath. Doors were barred. Windows were shuttered. The usually noisy cantina fell silent. The people of Dos Cruces knew a reckoning had come to their town, and they wanted no part of the bloodshed. The plaza, moments before a bustling center of evening life, became a dead, empty stage. Up at the hacienda, panic and paranoia reigned. Hollis, his face pale and slick with sweat, paced his study like a caged wolf. The scar-faced Marcus and the rat-faced Pike, the last 2 original vultures besides Hollis, watched him, their own fear warring with their ingrained instinct for survival. "What do we do, Bren?" Pike asked, his voice a nervous squeak. "He's just standing out there. It's him. It has to be the rancher." "Shut up," Hollis snarled. "Of course, it's him. He's trying to spook us, to draw us out." "It's working," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. He had seen the man's work at Diablo's Spine. "He's not just a man. He's a ghost." Hollis stopped his pacing and stared at his 2 remaining lieutenants. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the wavering of their resolve. He knew that if he showed any more weakness, they would turn on him or flee. He had to reassert his dominance. "A ghost," he said with a contemptuous laugh, though it sounded thin and forced. "He's one man with a rope. We are 3 men with guns, with a dozen more hired hands in this house. Are you telling me you're afraid of a farmer with a piece of twine?" He walked over to a heavy wooden chest and threw it open. Inside were several brand new, repeating Henry rifles. "We are not going to be his prey," he declared, his voice regaining some of its old, charismatic force. "We are going to be the hunters. We will turn this town into his tomb. Marcus, take 4 men and go in through the east side. Pike, you take 4 and circle around from the west. I will take the rest and go straight down the main street. We will corner him in that plaza and fill him with so much lead his own mother wouldn't recognize him. Now go." His words, and the promise of a straightforward gunfight, seemed to steady the men's nerves. They grabbed the rifles and filed out, their bravado returning. It was a sound plan, a classic pincer movement that would leave a man trapped in the open with no chance of escape. But Luke was not a classic opponent, and he had not come alone. As Pike and his men crept through the darkened western alleys, they found their path blocked by a silent, shadowy group of figures. The villagers of Dos Cruces. They were not armed with guns. They were old men, women, and young boys, armed with machetes, farming sickles, and a deep, burning hatred for the men who had oppressed them. They had seen Hollis's weakness, and they had seen the quiet, terrible strength of the stranger in the plaza. They had chosen their side. A vicious, silent, close-quarters battle erupted in the alleys, the grim work of knives and farm tools against surprised gunmen. On the other side of town, Marcus and his men were met with a similar fate. Their path was blocked, their ambush foiled by a silent, popular uprising. In the center of it all, Brent Hollis and his remaining 4 men strode down the main street, their rifles held at the ready. The street was eerily silent and empty. The silence unnerved him. "Where is he?" one of his men whispered, his eyes darting from one shadowed doorway to the next. Hollis scanned the plaza ahead. He saw the lone figure, still standing by the fountain and moving. "There," he said, a triumphant, cruel smile returning to his face. "The fool is just standing there waiting to die." They fanned out, taking aim. "On my mark," Hollis whispered. "Fire." The 5 rifles roared as one, a volley of thunder that shattered the silence. They filled the space where Luke had been standing with a storm of lead, bullets kicking up dust and chipping stone from the fountain. But when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone. "Where did he go?" a gunman yelled, frantically trying to reload. A sound from above answered him, the hiss of a rope through the air. A loop dropped from the roof of the cantina, settling perfectly around the man's neck. Before he could even cry out, he was yanked off his feet and dragged, choking, into the darkness of the alley beside the building. The remaining 3 gunmen stared in horror. Another one of them screamed and pointed toward the opposite roof, the roof of the church. A dark figure was standing there, a silhouette against the starry sky. They raised their rifles and fired, but the figure was already gone. It was a trap. Luke had used himself as bait, and now he was using the rooftops and alleys of the town as his personal hunting ground, picking them off one by one. Panic seized the remaining men. They began firing wildly at the rooftops, at the shadows, at the terrifying, unseen enemy that was all around them. Hollis, his face a mask of primal terror, finally understood. He was not the hunter. He was the prey, caught in a maze, being herded toward his doom. He screamed at his men to fall back, to get back to the hacienda. But it was too late. One man was pulled from a doorway, another felled by a heavy object dropped from a balcony. Hollis, now completely alone, turned and ran, his rifle forgotten, his mind consumed by a single, desperate impulse, to escape. He sprinted back up the main street, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the plaza, hoping to find a horse, a way out, and he escaped from the nightmare. And there, standing in the center of the empty plaza, right where he had been before, was Luke. He stood, his lariat coiled in his hand, his face calm and patient in the moonlight. He had been waiting for him. The entire battle, the uprising, the ghost-like attacks, it had all been a performance, a grand, terrible piece of theater designed to strip Hollis of his men, his power, and his courage. and to deliver him, alone and terrified, to this final, personal appointment. The Hangman's Plaza was ready for its last act. The world shrank to the size of the moonlit plaza. The sounds of the sporadic fighting in the alleys faded away, replaced by the thumping of Bryn Hollis's own terrified heart. He stood panting, his expensive boots scuffing in the dust, facing the man he had wronged, the ghost he had created. Luke Mercer did not move. He simply stood there, a patient, terrible statue, the braided rawhide of his lariat a dark serpent coiled in his hand. His face was a landscape of grief, carved by sun and sorrow, and his eyes held the flat, cold light of a distant star. There was no rage in them. There was no hatred. There was only a profound and absolute finality. Mercer, Hollis breathed, his voice a dry, cracking thing. He fumbled for the pistol at his hip, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get a grip. It was a beautiful, silver-inlaid weapon, a symbol of the wealth and power he had built on the bones of others. "You took my boy," Luke said, and his voice was not the whisper of the wind, but the low, grinding sound of stone on stone. "You took my wife." She was a fighter, Hollis sneered, his fear giving way to a final, desperate surge of his old, cruel arrogance. "I like a woman with spirit." The words were a calculated, venomous dart, meant to provoke, to throw his opponent off balance. But they had no effect. Luke's expression did not change. He was beyond insult, beyond pain. He was merely an instrument of a justice that had been too long delayed. Hollis finally managed to draw the silver pistol, its barrel wavering in his unsteady hand. "I left you alive once," he hissed. "It was a mistake. A mistake I'm about to fix." He fired. The gunshot was shockingly loud in the silent plaza, but the bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to Luke's left. Hollis fired again, a panicked, wild shot that whined off the stone of the fountain. Luke still did not move from his spot. He simply watched, his gaze unwavering, as if he were observing the frantic death throes of a trapped and poisonous animal. Hollis, his pistol empty, stared in disbelief. He had missed. At point-blank range, he had missed. The ghost was unhittable, untouchable. His bluster collapsed, and the raw, primal terror returned. He threw the useless, empty pistol at Luke and turned to run. And it was then that the rope sang. It flew through the air not with the wide, open loop of a cattleman, but with the tight, whizzing precision of a striking snake. It seemed to move with a malevolent intelligence of its own. It settled not around Hollis's neck, but around his ankles. Luke gave a single, sharp tug. Hollis's feet were ripped out from under him, and he crashed to the ground, his face plowing into the hard-packed dirt. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and sent a blinding flash of pain through his skull. Before he could recover, Luke was on him, moving with a speed that belied his gaunt frame. He did not kick or punch. He simply dragged the sputtering, terrified outlaw leader across the plaza, back to the central fountain. He looped the other end of the rope around the fountain's central, stone pillar and pulled it taut, pinning Hollis to the ground like a pinned insect. Hollis lay there, his cheek pressed into the dust, looking up at the man who stood over him. The face was no longer that of a simple farmer. It was the face of a fury, of a biblical angel of vengeance, terrible and righteous in its wrath. "Please," Hollis whispered, the word a pathetic, bloody bubble on his lips. "Mercy. I'll give you anything. Gold. Land." Luke knelt beside him, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked down at the man who had destroyed his world, and he felt nothing. The great, burning fire of his rage had finally burned itself out, leaving only a cold, gray ash. The hunt was over. All that was left was the final, grim task. He reached out and took Hollis by the hair, lifting his head from the dust. He looked him directly in the eyes. "The sun is coming up," Luke said, his voice as quiet and as final as the grave. "My boy." He loved to watch the sunrise. He then proceeded to do what he had come to do. There was no quick, clean snap of a neck. There was only the rope, his hands, and a slow, methodical, and terrible accounting. It was not an execution. It was a disassembly. When the first rays of the unforgiving sun broke over the horizon, they illuminated a scene of stark, biblical justice. Bryn Hollis was dead, his body a broken testament to the fact that some debts can only be paid in blood and pain. Luke Mercer stood in the center of the plaza, the red light of the dawn washing over him. The rope, its work finally done, was coiled in his hand. The ledger was balanced. The harvest was complete. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a man who had lost everything, and in the brutal calculus of the West, had taken back the only thing he could. An eye for an eye. A life for a life. A fire for a fire. He stood alone in the silence, a monument to a father's love and a hangman's grief, waiting for the sun to burn away the shadows. But he knew, in the cold, empty place where his heart used to be, that some shadows can never be erased. The sun rose higher, baking the dust of the plaza and the blood that stained it. The people of Tres Cruces began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of trepidation and a dawning, disbelieving hope. They saw the carnage. They saw the bodies of Hollis's men in the alleys and the broken form of Hollis himself at the fountain. And they saw the silent, gaunt figure standing watch, his terrible work complete. Luke Mercer was no longer an avenger. He was just a man, hollowed out and exhausted, standing in the ruins of a war he had started and finished. The fire of his purpose, which had burned so brightly and so hot, had been extinguished with the last breath of Bren Hollis. Now, there was only the cold and the quiet. He looked at the cold rope in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted not just with braided rawhide, but with the lives of 12 men and the ghost of the man he had once been. The villagers approached him slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a sleeping wolf. An old woman, her face a testament to a long and difficult life, came forward and offered him a clay jug of water. Her son had been one of the young men Hollis had killed in a fit of paranoia. She did not speak. She simply held out the jug, her dark, ancient eyes filled with a profound and sorrowful gratitude. Luke took the jug and drank. The water was cool and clean. It was the first act of simple human kindness he had accepted in what felt like a lifetime. He looked at the faces of the people gathering around him. He saw no fear in their eyes. He saw a kind of weary kinship. He was a monster, a killer, but he had been their monster. He had cleansed their town of a greater evil. He did not want their gratitude. He did not want their reverence. He wanted only to be gone. He turned, without a word, and began to walk away, back toward the hills from which he had come. No one tried to stop him. They simply parted, creating a silent, respectful path for the ghost to pass. He walked for a full day, back into the harsh, indifferent wilderness that had become his only real home. He found a secluded spot, a small, hidden canyon with a trickle of a spring and a single, gnarled cottonwood tree. Here, under the vast and empty sky, the full weight of what he had done, and what he had become, finally settled upon him. He had succeeded. He had avenged them. Every man who had participated in the destruction of his family was dead. The ledger was balanced. But there was no peace. There was no satisfaction. There was only a void, an emptiness so vast and so profound that it threatened to swallow him whole. He had thought that vengeance would be a destination, an end to his pain. But he saw now that it was only a different kind of prison. He looked at the rope in his hands. It was a thing of horror now, stained with the blood and terror of his quest. It was the symbol of his fall from a man who creates to a man who only destroys. He thought of the tree, of its high, sturdy branches. The thought was a quiet, seductive whisper in the back of his mind. The final knot, the one for himself. It would be so easy to finally find the peace that had eluded him, to join the family he had so brutally avenged. He stood up and walked to the tree. He threw one end of the rope over a thick, low-hanging branch. He fashioned a loop, the final, familiar knot coming to his hands with a practiced ease. He stood there for a long time, the noose in his hand, looking out at the barren, beautiful landscape. He saw the face of his wife, smiling at him from the porch of a house that was no longer there. He heard the laughter of his son, chasing butterflies that had long since turned to dust. And he knew he could not do it. To take his own life would be a final, selfish act. It would be an escape, a mercy he did not deserve. His punishment was not to die. His punishment was to live. To live with the ghosts, to live with the silence, to carry the weight of the rope for whatever time he had left. It was a sentence of a different kind, a quiet, walking damnation more profound than any quick and easy death. With a deep, shuddering sigh, he unfastened the loop. He did not throw the rope away. It was a part of him now, a terrible, indelible piece of his soul. He coiled it and tied it to his belt, where it would remain, a constant, physical reminder of the man he was. Then, he turned his back on the tree and the temptation it offered, and he began to walk again, a solitary figure moving deeper into the wilderness, a man with no destination, seeking not an end, but a way to endure the long, empty road ahead. The legend of the hangman of the Red Vultures became one of the West's most enduring and chilling tales. It was different from the stories of gunfighters like Wild Bill Hickok or Billy the Kid. Theirs were stories of explosive, public violence, of fame and notoriety. The hangman's story was a whisper, a ghost story about a silent, implacable force that moved in the shadows, a form of justice that was as personal and as quiet as a dying breath. As the years went by, the story became embellished, as all such stories do. Some said the hangman was not a man at all, but a demon summoned from the ashes of a burned-out home. Others said he was the ghost of a lawman who had been betrayed, forever doomed to hunt the wicked. The core of the story, however, remained the same, the tale of a man who, stripped of everything, had used the simplest of tools to deliver a terrible and unforgettable reckoning. And Luke Mercer, the man at the heart of the legend, simply vanished. He became a ghost of the plains, a wanderer who actively sought out the most remote and desolate corners of the country. He avoided towns, shunned the company of men, and lived a life of monastic, self-imposed exile. He became a creature of the wilderness, his senses attuned to the subtle language of the land. He learned the patterns of the hawk and the coyote, the taste of wild roots, the way to find water in a dry land. The gaunt, haunted man became as tough and as weathered as the landscape he inhabited, his skin turned to leather by the sun and wind, his eyes holding the vast, empty stillness of the prairie sky. He was not entirely without human contact. From time to time, his path would cross with those on the fringes of society, a lone trapper, a small, isolated tribe of displaced natives, a family of homesteaders struggling on a forgotten patch of land. With these people, he found a strange, unspoken kinship. They were survivors, people who understood loss and hardship. He never spoke of his past. He never gave his name. He was simply the stranger, the silent man who would appear out of the wilderness, his only possession a coiled rawhide rope on his belt. But his actions spoke for him. He would help a family mend a broken wagon wheel, hunt for meat for a starving tribe, or stand a silent, watchful guard for a homesteader whose land was being threatened by greedy cattlemen. He never used the rope for violence again, but its presence, and the cold, quiet authority of the man who carried it, was often enough. There were stories of would-be claim jumpers or bullies who would take one look at the silent man with the dead eyes and the rope on his hip and decide to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The legend had taken on a life of its own, and it now served as his shield and his weapon. The symbol of his damnation had become, in a strange and bitter irony, a tool for protecting the innocent. Each small act of kindness was a penance. Each family he helped was a desperate, silent apology to the family he had failed. He was not seeking forgiveness. He knew he was beyond that. He was simply trying to add some small weight to the other side of the scales, to balance the ledger of his life, which was so heavily stained with blood. He was a man caught between two worlds. He could never go back to the life of the rancher, the builder, the husband. The ghost of the hangman, the destroyer, was always with him. But he refused to let that ghost be the only thing he was. He lived in a quiet purgatory of his own making, using the terrible skills he had learned as a killer to serve as a guardian for the weak, a silent, anonymous protector of the very kind of people whose loss had set him on his dark path. He was a myth, a whisper on the wind, a man who had been to hell and back and was now doomed to wander the earth, forever trying to find his way out of the long, dark shadow of the rope. The end of Luke Mercer's story, like its beginning, is a quiet and lonely affair. It is not a tale of a final, glorious battle, but of a slow fading, like a campfire burning down to its last glowing embers. Many years after the events enters Cruces, an old, gray-bearded man, his body stooped and weathered by a lifetime of hardship, was found by a young circuit-riding preacher in the high, cold mountains of Montana. The old man was living in a crude, one-room cabin he had built himself, miles from any town or settlement. He was dying, not from a bullet or a knife, but from the slow, relentless ravages of time and a harsh life. The preacher, a young man full of compassion, stayed with the old man in his final days, tending to him, reading to him from the Bible. The old man rarely spoke, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. But on his last day, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light through the cabin's single window, he seemed to find a final, fleeting clarity. He told the preacher a story of a woman with a sunflower smile, and a little boy with fiery red hair. He spoke of a fire, of a terrible, all-consuming grief, and of a long, dark road. He spoke as if from a great distance, his voice devoid of anger or self-pity, the tale a simple, unadorned recitation of a life that had been broken and remade in the crucible of sorrow. When the story was finished, the old man's gaze fell upon the single object that decorated his bare, humble cabin. Hanging on a wooden peg on the wall was a long, dark, braided rawhide rope. It was old and worn, but still perfectly coiled. The preacher noticed that tied into the rope, at measured intervals, were 12 distinct, tight knots. The weight of it, the old man whispered, his breath shallow. A man should build things, not break them. Those were his last words. He died as the sun dipped below the horizon, his passing as quiet and as peaceful as the mountain twilight. The young preacher buried him on the hillside, overlooking the vast, silent wilderness that had been his only companion. He fashioned a simple wooden cross to mark the spot. He did not know the old man's name, so he left the cross blank. He was about to leave, to continue on his circuit, but he paused and went back into the cabin. He stood for a long time, looking at the coiled rope on the wall. It seemed to hold a palpable aura of sorrow, a physical manifestation of a lifetime of pain. He understood that it was both a tool of vengeance and a cross that the old man had forced himself to bear. With a sense of performing a final, sacred rite, the preacher took the rope down from the wall. He carried it outside and, in the dying light, he began the laborious process of untying the 12 knots. The rawhide was stiff and old, and the knots had been pulled tight by a terrible, relentless purpose. It took him over an hour. When the last knot was finally undone, the rope was just a rope again, a simple, honest tool of a cattleman's trade. The preacher coiled it neatly and laid it at the base of the freshly dug grave. The ledger was balanced. The harvest was complete. The weight had finally been lifted. As he rode away from that lonely grave, the preacher knew he had been in the presence of a great and terrible story. He did not know the name of the man he had buried, but he knew he had borne witness to the end of a legend. The hangman was gone, his terrible purpose fulfilled, his penance served. All that was left was a quiet grave, a blank cross, and the silent, enduring peace of the mountains, which, in their infinite, stony mercy, had finally granted a broken man the rest he could never find in life.